Hey everybody, it is World Mental Health Day, and this year they're focusing in, the WHO, the World Health Organization, is focusing in on youth mental health and adolescent mental health. Now I'm going to be honest with you, I forgot that this was happening, so this video is going to be a little sloppy. I had it on my calendar somewhere, and I think I just didn't have a reminder set or something, so I actually wanted to talk about something I've been wanting to talk about for a very long time, and I think it's relevant to youth and adolescent mental health, so I'm gonna shove the two together and hopefully this will be something that you enjoy watching. And what I want to talk about is how personality disorders form. Like, what is the cause of personality disorders? And specifically what I'm going to be talking about is my theory on what's going on and why personality disorders happen. So let me just say right off the bat, I am not a licensed professional. I've always made that clear on my channel to anybody who watches. If you have a problem with that, if you don't think it's okay that I should be talking about these things, then why are you on YouTube, first of all? And second of all, take your butt, get off of YouTube, go to PubMed, do like I did, look at the research papers, and form your own opinion. I'm just here giving my opinion of why I think that personality disorders happen, because we don't have any conclusive evidence. I mean, of course we have evidence of things, but we don't have like a full, comprehensive picture from the evidence of why personality disorders happen. So I'm just giving you my take on things. I know that the professional world maybe won't come out here and say this because we don't have all of the stuff that we need to confirm that this is what's going on, but like, come on, can we use a little common sense here and put things together? And, you know, really what it's about is helping people. If we put things together and it helps us develop treatments that help people, does it really matter if we have all the information? I don't think so. Okay, so to start off with personality disorders, you're not supposed to diagnose a personality disorder before like the teenage years, and there's a good reason for that. There's a lot of changes that go on in a child's brain and in an adolescent's brain that are relevant to the personality, and really those changes continue on through like age 25. The brain keeps growing, and even beyond age 25 your brain still changes a lot, but like the most bulk of development changes around 25. So this is why, especially in that pivotal area, when teenagers are changing, as we all go through in adolescence, we don't want to diagnose before then because we don't know exactly what's going on, because the brain is going through a lot of weird shit. And frankly, a lot of behavior that might look personality disordered or might look like other mental illnesses is really just normal behavior for a brain that's like getting used to this thing that we call life. It takes a while. We are not born knowing everything we need to know. So when we talk about any mental illness, there's always this ongoing debate about, well, is it genetic? Like, is it predetermined that someone's going to have a mental illness? Or is it like environmental? Is maybe something like trauma involved that causes a mental illness? And for the majority of mental illnesses, I think you'll find that it's a combination of both. I do think that there are certain mental illnesses, like maybe schizophrenia or bipolar, that seem to lean a little bit more towards genetic and having structural changes in the nervous system and the brain that don't seem to be triggered necessarily by the environment, at least in the origin of why these things happen. But then other things like personality disorders, if you watch my channel for any length of time, you know that I love digging into personality disorders because I just think they're so interesting. I think personality is such a personal part of who we are, and I think it's interesting that something about that can go like a little off, and we may not even realize that it's off. So with personality disorders, I think it's a little bit of both, to be honest. I think there's a little bit of a genetic component, and maybe in some people, genetics is much more important, and I also think there's the trauma component, and I think trauma needs to be talked like way more when it comes to things like personality disorders. So what I'm going to do is try to give my idea of how, I don't know, like I said, this is going to be sloppy, this is going to be messy. This is how I think that personality disorders are caused. I'm going to just go with what I can, because I have all these like things in my brain that I want to pull out, and I'm going to forget some of them, and I'm going to hate myself for forgetting them, but let me just give you as much as I can, and then you can go from there. So I believe that trauma is a very important component in the reason why most people have a personality disorder. And that's because I believe that personality disorders are generally a reaction to something that we're feeling inside of our body, or the way that a system in our body is either going awry, going off, or a system in our body is hypersensitive to something like stress, or we don't have the skills to manage the stress and keep it down. So when I say system, I'm talking about neurological systems, meaning the nerves, the brain, and the connections in our body. Don't forget, like, we talk about mental disorders and we think about the brain, but the brain is connected to the rest of the body, the whole thing. So it's not like it's all up here. It's not just all in your head. You're feeling your mental disorder. You're experiencing it. It's coloring the way you see your entire life. And there have been studies that have shown when people experience trauma, especially in childhood, when the brain is like still young and fresh and developing, but also later in life, that it can create personality changes, and it creates structural changes in the brain. We've seen things like hippocampal volume being lower in people who've experienced PTSD, and we've seen things like in narcissistic personality disorder where there seems to be less gray matter. And I don't know all the details of all of these things. I'm sorry. Again, go look at the research if you want to learn more, but there are structural changes, and I don't think that they're permanent changes, but they're like semi-permanent. They're permanent enough to cause a problem and disruption in how you relate to your own body. Okay, so we have all of these labels for personality disorders, and they drive me a little bit crazy, to be quite honest, because like borderline and narcissistic and antisocial and histrionic, avoidant dependent, schizotypal, schizoid, all these things, I feel like generally what we're really describing are personality traits, and the labels are kind of stupid because half the time when, not half the, okay, let's not make statistics up here, but, you know, a lot of the time when people have a personality disorder, they also have another personality disorder. Like, there's a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of overlap because there are personality traits. Like, these labels are just stupid labels that don't make any sense, and I'm so glad when it comes to the International Classification of Diseases, at least, we're getting rid of the labels. So I would love it if the entire internet just stopped using personality disorder labels and started focusing on traits. But then what are traits? And to me, traits are a defense mechanism. It's a way of trying to cope with life, and specifically, it's a way of trying to cope with your experience of life, how you feel life in your body. Usually anxiety. Now I have to be careful here because even when we talk about something like anxiety is a little bit of a vague word, just like all these stupid labels are vague. I'm so fed up with the system of mental health and how we talk about mental health. But anxiety is related to systems in our body. One system could be, the obvious one, is the fear system. Okay, we have the fear system when we feel like our life is threatened, when something becomes overwhelming and we're not sure if we can really handle it. That's that feeling of fight or flight when we start feeling our heart beating faster and we sweat and we freak out a little bit. I think we're all pretty familiar with that, but anxiety can also come up with different systems in the body. For example, one that I don't think gets talked about enough is the panic and grief system, which is kind of like that attachment system you'll sometimes hear about, which is when somebody's leaving you, when somebody's exiting your life, when they die maybe, that system comes online and we freak out a little bit. I always say, think about the baby bird, and like when the mother and the father are not around, the baby bird chirps because they're panicking. They're like, oh no, I can't do anything for myself here. And I know when we're adults, we say adults should be able to handle things, but adults get fears too. Adults have these problems. It's a system. It's in your body. You don't like eliminate the system just because you become an adult. So when somebody's leaving you, like a loved one or, I don't know, a parent, whoever, like the baby birds, you chirp and you try to get them to come back. And then eventually, if they don't come back, you start to like shut down and get depressed. And it's like, these are natural things. These are just like normal, natural things that people experience. I don't even know why people question this. Like, it's in your body. It's how we operate. Why is this questionable? And there's more to it than that, but this is not going to become like a 3-hour video. So you got these emotional systems in your body, and some people's emotional systems, possibly due to trauma, are a little bit overreactive, or they're not quite operating correctly, and it could be, you know, so many different reasons for this, and part of it could be genetics. It could be just you were born with a system that's a little bit off. And that's not to say that you can't do anything about it. I never want to make it sound like, oh, well, you were just genetically born this way, so sorry, you're screwed. There's nothing you can do. There's always something you can do to better your life and better your mental health. But when it comes to personality disorders and personality traits, which to me are the components of personality disorders, the personality traits are ways of trying to cope with these overwhelming feelings in the body. So for example, let's say you just lost a loved one. It's a breakup. Let's say it's a breakup. I've been doing breakup videos. You just broke up with somebody, so your panic and grief system comes online. It's like, holy crap, what are we gonna do? Like, this really sucks. And you're freaking out, and you're crying all the time, and you're upset or whatever. And by the way, if you're not upset, maybe that's a coping mechanism. Maybe that's part of your disorder. Maybe that's a personality trait. Maybe you just generally have anhedonia because you've kind of like shut down. We'll talk about shutting down in a minute, but maybe you just have anhedonia and you have a flat affect and you're just kind of like whatever about things. Maybe that's your way of coping with these overwhelming feelings because they're so overwhelming, you're just like, you know what, I'm just not dealing with it. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with temporarily dealing with problems in a way that's maybe not the best. Like, we all do that. Like, we have to cope with life. It's okay to cope with life, but it becomes a personality problem when it's a long-standing pattern of like, this is the only way you ever deal with anything, and you never seem to kind of like grow past it and figure out other ways that maybe are a little bit more healthy. So you lost your friend and you shut down, and maybe that's a part of an avoidance strategy, and maybe like it lends itself more towards something that we would call avoidant personality disorder, or maybe it's a borderline thing and like you shut down and you're kind of like depressed about the world, you know, that depressivity that we see in borderline. There's a lot of ways to describe what's going on here. I just want to help you understand the connection between like, I'm feeling something, it's really uncomfortable, I'm not good at managing it, but I have this strategy, and it doesn't mean that I'm like thinking like I'm gonna use this strategy to fix the problem. It just means like, this is the way that you were taught, this is the way that you grew up, this is the thing that you figured out to do to cope, and like, this is the way that you operate in the world. You know, somebody like OCPD, maybe like they figured out like, I can make myself feel better if I find something that I can control and I focus on that and I manage that. That's my coping mechanism. Or somebody who has antisocial personality disorder, the way that they can cope is to like hurt somebody and feel more powerful than somebody else. Like, all right, I get like jumbled up here because I don't want to make generalizations here, but I'm just trying to give you the general idea. Okay, so let's talk about trauma a little bit more. So the brain and the body, it's all connected through these nerves, and one of the most important nerves is the vagus nerve. I have a book back here. I have not read it yet. I'm excited. I really want to. I'm laughing because I just like never have time to read anything, but I really want to read it. It's the polyvagal theory, and it involves this vagus nerve, it's called. The vagus nerve is connected to a lot of different parts of our body, like our stomach and our throat and all kinds of different areas that are important for like normal things that we do. And one of the things that has always fascinated me, especially when it comes to anxiety and things like personality disorders and trauma, is that this vagus nerve can do things like shut us down, and it can make our heart race, and it can make, at least my understanding of the nerve, and anybody can go ahead and correct me and cite your sources or whatever, but my understanding is that it controls a lot of important functions in the body, like your breathing. And I always tell people, when you're over anxious, and I know people get frustrated and pissed off when people tell them to breathe, but it's a real strategy, and it's like one of the best strategies that's always helped me. When you're overwhelmed and you're feeling too stressed out and like you can't handle things, instead of like jumping to these defense strategies that you use, which again, it's okay if you use them, but a great alternative, because it's utilizing the system that's already there to manage your anxiety, is to breathe, because breathing slows down your heart rate. It slows down that process of getting overwhelmed and freaking out and maybe even shutting down or dissociating, which I'm going to get to. And it allows you to kind of like get a grip and have your rational thinking come back online. And that's something else we need to talk about. When these systems take over, your emotional system in your body, okay, your emotional system is earlier developed than your thinking system. You know, we have evolved as animals, as creatures in this world, and the emotional system is built in to help us survive much more than the thinking system. And the emotional system gets priority because it's lower in the brain. It's just like more basic and more important. So when we're feeling overwhelmed and freaked out and emotional and angry and upset and all these other things that we're feeling, that system shuts down the thinking super quick. It's like, sorry, thinking, you're not important right now. I'm important. So if we can interrupt that process of it taking over when appropriate, you know, obviously if you're in danger, you don't want to shut that system down because it's telling you you're in danger. But if you can like look around and see like, oh, okay, I'm not actually in danger, I'm just feeling in danger. If you can breathe and slow things down and stop that system, then you have the capacity to think again. Because once that system comes online, thinking out the window. Empathy for other people, out the window. Speaking of empathy, this is something that really gets on my nerves, especially when we talk about narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. People don't lack empathy unless they have that system like genetically having like a serious problem. And I'm not saying that's not a possibility. But in general, I think for most people, when they're having trouble with empathy and they're having trouble relating to other people, as we see in personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, they're stressed. That's what's happening. And, you know, you can debate me on this, that's fine. But as far as I'm concerned, that's what's happening. They don't feel empathy. They're not thinking about you because they can't even think. That part of their brain is not even online. All they can do is manage the emotion, and they're trying to manage the emotion with the defense mechanisms like in narcissism of attention seeking or making themselves better than you and feel grandiose or whatever. So it's not that they don't have empathy. When they're more calm, you might see that they do show empathy and they do seem to have some interest in you and care about you, but when they're feeling upset and anxious, which is probably often the case with people with narcissistic personality disorder because they have such low self-esteem and they feel so crappy about themselves all the time, even if they don't acknowledge it, they're stressed out. And being stressed out all the time every day, they don't have the room or the capacity in the brain to think about you and how you're feeling. And I know that sucks for you to be on the receiving end of that, and that's a normal and natural reaction. But that's what's going on. It's stress. It's the body. It's what they're feeling in their body that they're reacting to. And they're trying to just get through the day and manage that. And this brings me back to that vagus nerve that I was mentioning. Because the vagus nerve, and again, I still have to learn about this, so I'm speaking a little bit from what I've heard. The vagus nerve has to do with what's called the social engagement system. And the social engagement system are those things that we maybe would think of as empathy. Things like having good eye contact with somebody. Think of like body language and how you read somebody else's body language. And you can kind of like just tell when you look at somebody like, oh, they're really sad, and you feel something when you look at them. You're like, oh, and you start to feel it yourself a little bit, or you see somebody's like angry face like approaching you and you're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna back away from this person. That's a social engagement system. It's how we learn about each other and communicate with each other. And I believe that when we're stressed out and we're using all these coping mechanisms, like that system is not functioning at full capacity. And it's harder to see somebody else's pain because we're so stuck in trying to deal with our own pain. All right, so where does trauma fit into all of this? Trauma, I really feel like needs to be discussed more and more and more. Trauma, okay. Some people hear trauma and they think like, whatever, people are just being a bunch of wussies, just get over it, like life sucks and whatever, you're just like not, screw you. No, buddy, I got news for you. There has been plenty of research on trauma, and basically you're wrong. Yes, there are people who experience trauma, and you know what? They have coping mechanisms, and they have resilience, and they have resources, and they get through it. You might be like, well, I was hit as a kid, and I didn't turn out like that. Well, you had resources. You know, Oprah did this special thing on 60 Minutes, I think it was, here in the United States about trauma, and I love something that she said. She had been through a lot in her childhood. You can go look up her story if you want to, but she could never understand, like, how come I made it out of all of that okay, and nobody else that she knew with trauma and all this stuff, like, she couldn't understand, like a lot of us can't understand, like what I did fine, so why can't other people do fine? And then she finally realized it's because she had a teacher that she could go to who supported her, who believed in her as a child and kind of like helped nurture her and grow her. And a lot of children especially, because remember, children don't have coping skills. Children don't just come into the world like knowing how to fight for themselves and how to deal with the stresses of life and how to relate to their own emotions and stuff. We have to teach people that. We have to teach our children like what it means to survive. That's socially passed on. That's not just like a genetic thing. But speaking of genetics, let me also mention that there's also the possibility, and I think it's been shown a little bit, that some people genetically are more predisposed to be affected by things like trauma. You know, some people just have a system that's more sensitive, or it's a little bit off in that way. And stress in general may just overwhelm them a little bit more. I think what you can really take away from this is that no two people are alike, and it really doesn't matter whether it's genetics or you want to compare like one trauma versus another trauma. Everybody's a little different, and there's no reason to invalidate somebody as saying like, well, you just didn't try hard enough, or you just don't care to get over your mental illness. It's just stupid to have that mentality. I don't know who you think you're helping when you have that kind of a mentality. It really doesn't matter if you haven't been affected by a particular trauma, but somebody else has. Just people are affected and they need help. Okay, so anyway, trauma also affects your nervous system and changes the way that your fear system especially relates to things. You know, we've heard about things like flashbacks, and your memories get distorted and your autobiographical information gets distorted, basically meaning that you have a hard time creating a narrative of your life and seeing things through from like start to finish in your brain. Like things become very narrow and shortened. And really, if you ask me, this is all like just normal functioning of our body systems. Like your body needs to remember things that are threatening, so of course it creates fragmented memories of that thing, because it's like, this is really important and we need to be cautious around this, so let's encode it and let's not make it like we have to think about it. Let's just encode the most important things. And it kind of makes sense to me that when your fear system's activated, like you would only focus on the present moment and you wouldn't be thinking about like 5 years ago and 5 years from now, and you wouldn't see the whole picture of everything. It just makes sense to me that you wouldn't be so concerned about articulating your experience, and that's why Broca's area isn't so functioning. I don't know, just intuitively that makes sense to me. So I think this is the normal functioning of the system. It's just with things like trauma, when it really affects us to the point where we get like post-traumatic stress disorder, it's overly activated. It's happening a little too strongly, and people just get stuck and they have a hard time coping with life. And I think that hard time with coping with life and that overactive system that's a little hypersensitive to things leads to poor coping mechanisms, which we could call maladaptive personality traits, which result in a personality disorder. Patterns of behavior which we use to try to cope with the feelings we're experiencing because of normal life stressors that we find too overwhelming to deal with. So one thing you might think to yourself is like, well, if these patterns are maladaptive, if these personality traits are bad and society generally doesn't like approve of them, then like why do they continue? Well, first of all, there are some people that do continue these personality traits. There are enablers in this world, and people enable for all kinds of different reasons. Sometimes people use other people to get things that they want, like love and affection or money or gifts or whatever the hell they want. Enabling sucks. Don't enable other people and their poor behavior. Stop it. But I also kind of have this feeling generally that somebody who enables also has their own personality problems, and it's kind of like this mingling of personality disorders. You maybe have heard of borderline and narcissistic personality disorder often forming in romantic relationships, and I think it's kind of that related thing, that they use each other to try to cope in maladaptive ways, because the maladaptive coping mechanisms kind of fit together in a way that could be a pattern reciprocal relationship to help manage the stresses day to day in a really messed up way. But if we take the relationships, the romantic relationships thing off the table in general, like why do the patterns persist? Well, for one thing, they're working, you know, they're helping somebody to cope. They're just not helping them cope in the best way possible. Like it's, how do I say this? Between a trade-off of surviving, which is what these coping mechanisms are for, is to survive, and maybe having trouble in a relationship, you're probably gonna choose surviving, staying alive, as opposed to, maybe not having the best relationship. And again, your body's choosing for you. It's not the thinking brain that's in control, it's the emotional brain, lower down. So this is part of the reason why they persist, because they're working. And another reason why they persist is because each time you repeat a behavior, you're reinforcing that connection in your brain, that neuron, that the string of neurons, the pattern of neurons, whatever you want to call it, that's encoded. This is the way to cope. Each time you do it, you're saying like, okay, this is how I cope. This is how I cope. The dopamine system, the seeking system, is all about rewarding you and keeping you doing things repetitively that make you feel good. So if you deal with things this way and it does get you through to the other side, it's like, oh, okay, I'm still alive. That's good. And that system, that channel in your brain, that pattern, whatever you want to call it, gets reinforced. It's in your body. Again, your body's trying to survive here. So it's telling you like, okay, this personality, even though it might hurt sometimes, you're still alive. That's important. And what I wish people would understand more is that, especially since we don't learn about personality disorders until like after adolescence, like a lot of these patterns may have been going on in somebody's life since birth. And if not since birth, probably for years, because we're not good at recognizing mental health problems. We're not good at having services and places that people can get support. So when you repeat something for years and years and years, and it's gotten you to where you are so far, it's really hard to change and switch away from that. Anybody who's tried to change a habit knows that it's not something that you just do like that. It's very difficult, and especially when we're talking about survival fears, changing a habit away from surviving is really, really difficult. And this is why I always try to tell people, like, go in and see a therapist, because that is what they are trained to do. And if you rely on your friends and your family and reading stuff on the internet, it's only going to get you so far. And I'm not going to say it's impossible to deal with a personality problem on your own, but just go to the professionals. They know what they're doing. Some of them. And the other component to all of this, which really upsets me a lot, and I really don't know what the best solution for it is other than to bring awareness, is that a lot of people don't know another way to cope, and they were never taught another way to cope. And when they're just like caught in a bubble. We hear about these bubbles on the internet, and bubbles, and I don't know, bubbles are the thing lately. And I think there's some truth to that. Some people only congregate in their church group and like they just stay there. And some people aren't even online, or some people are online and they're only on Tumblr, or they're only with their small Facebook group of people, and they never like go out from there. I've known people who they only stay with like a certain group of friends their entire life, and they never get to know anybody else. Okay, I wanted to move on to dissociation and shutting down, because this is the fear system. As far as I'm aware, it's generally the fear system that's activating. It could be maybe the rage system too. It's like basically when your allostatic load gets overwhelmed. Allostatic load, from my understanding, is just kind of like the amount of stress that your body can tolerate. There's only so many hormones that can be released in your body, and there's only so much anxiety and nervous system interaction that your body can handle. And at some point, it just says, enough. And the vagus nerve, at least from my understanding, kind of like shuts down a lot of body functions, and that could lead to dissociating. And dissociating, for those that don't know, is kind of like zoning out. It's a wide range of intensities, but like at the most basic, it's kind of like zoning out and not paying that close attention, maybe to the point where you won't have a memory of something that you talked about like 5 minutes ago. But then like really, really heavy dissociation could be something like dissociative identity disorder, where you have like cut off pieces of your personality. And this is generalizing, I know, please forgive me, but you have sectioned off personalities all within your body, which is really confusing because you have dissociative amnesia that's separating them from each other. Or another extreme example could be like just missing giant chunks of time. Or you could just be like I was for years and years and years, thinking you had a medical problem and you were always exhausted, and maybe you have sleep apnea, or maybe it's a thyroid problem, and I don't know, but I never seem to have energy for anything. And again, if you have a concern like this, please go see a real doctor in person for them to check you out. But see if they know what dissociation is, or see a therapist and see if maybe that could also be a possibility, because I wish I knew about this sooner. But dissociation is not fully being present and not like really being able to focus all the time. Again, we want to be careful because it could be something like ADHD you're experiencing, but dissociation needs to be a word that people need to know, and I'm upset that people don't know it. What I'm really just trying to get at here is that trauma can lead to dissociative problems, and dissociative problems are not just limited to the dissociative disorders. I mean, we've heard a lot about it with borderline personality disorder, but I'm pretty sure like it's involved with a lot of personality disorders, because when you have a personality problem, a lot of the time people don't even realize, like, oh, this is different from the way that other people see the world, or, oh, did I really do that? Are you sure? And there's like identity disturbance in personality disorders, and I think that identity disturbance comes from the dissociation in part, and the problems with narrative and autobiographical information. Like, all of this stuff connects to me, and I don't know if I'm even getting any of it across in the way that I would like to get it across to you, but there's so much to me that makes sense, that connects, and I don't see people talking about it enough. I think that researchers know or have a clue. I think that trauma specialists know, but I don't see it talked about enough, and that's really upsetting to me, because I think a lot of people have personality problems. If they don't have full-blown personality disorders, at least they have problems. And it seems to me like a lot of people are going through life, youth and adolescents included here on World Mental Health Day, struggling like their whole lives, or most of their lives, when we have answers and we have solutions to these things. And I wish that we understood things like personality disorders a little bit better, because if I hear one more person arguing about like, well, do I have this disorder or that disorder, I'm gonna freaking scream, because it really doesn't freaking matter. You have personality trait problems and you need to go in and see somebody and get help for it. Like, we need to be addressing the real problem here and not arguing over stupid things like what to call the problem. Let's fix the personality problem. What traits do you have? What are the things that you do when you get stressed out that you're struggling with? Okay, do you dissociate? Well, okay, let's see. So you dissociate, you also seem to get hostile a lot and angry at other people, and you lash out, and that's creating problems with your relationships. Okay, well, you're lashing out maybe because you're dissociating and you're cranky and you're upset because you have a lot of anxiety, because you just can't cope with life. So you know what? Anxiety seems to be at the root here, causing the dissociation. So whenever you feel like you're getting anxious, let's give you some techniques to ground yourself. Let's give you some techniques to manage those body feelings, because it seems like you do understand that it's not appropriate to be getting so hostile and angry over these things, and you seem to recognize that most other people don't get hostile and angry over these things. So let's start with the root of the problem, which is the anxiety, which it seems like in your case might be a combination of trauma and having a sensitive system. So let's work on that. Let's talk about the anxiety. Why do you feel that? What are the things that bring the anxiety? What are those situations? Can we recognize those situations in advance so that you can start to take control over your body instead of your body taking control over you? Because if we can do that, maybe we can slow down the dissociation, and maybe with some practice eventually stop the dissociation. And then you'll have a little bit more awareness of what you're doing when you get hostile. And maybe it'll take some practice. You're going to still get hostile at people, and that's okay, because that's how you cope. But maybe with some practice, you'll start to change your habit. Even though it feels threatening, even though it feels scary, I'm going to be here with you because I'm a professional, and this is me just talking now. I'm not a professional, but I'm just throwing out a scenario here. Like, I'm going to be here to support you. You know what? Maybe you didn't have a parent who was able to cope themselves, and they never taught you how to cope. And I'm going to be the one to teach you now, because I'm a therapist, and I'm licensed, and I understand trauma, so let's walk through this together. I'm going to hold your hand through this, and we're going to get you on the road to form of recovery here. And then you don't have to feel so hostile, and you don't have to feel like everything needs to be in order all the time the way that you need it. And you can live and breathe in the world in a way that feels much more comfortable and relaxed, and you're not stressed all the time, and you're not having relationship problems. Like, why are we not seeing this more, this discussion more? It really bothers me, and this is my theory on why personality disorders happen. Again, I do think there is a genetic component. In some people, it could be that there's like a heavy genetic component, and it could be like their system for social engagement and empathy is just like not so great. But that doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do. We can still work on it. The brain always can be worked on. You can always change the connections in the brain and make new connections. So I just wish we talked about these things more. We talked about them more articulately. We talked about them in less black and white terms. We started to see the intricacies of life and human experience. Please. Okay, so I know that I mentioned dissociative identity disorder here, and I know it's not a personality disorder. Again, this is like classification stuff, which I don't really love, feeling like we need to classify everything perfectly, but I just bring it up because it's related to dissociation, and trauma seems to be at the core of that too, so why not talk about them all? Okay, I'm sure that there are things that I have left out that I'm gonna watch this back as I'm editing and say, oh, I wish I had said that, but whatever. This is a good base for you to start thinking about like what causes personality disorders. Maybe you're thinking for yourself or other people who have personality disorders. I just want to say, like, just because you have a personality disorder, it doesn't mean like it's the end of the world. Like, you can manage it, you can deal with it. There are things that you can do for every kind of problem. So do not feel like things are hopeless if you feel like you or somebody else has a personality disorder. Of course, if somebody else has a personality disorder, that's for them to deal with. You can support them in the best way possible, but again, they need to make the changes that they need to make. I'm sorry that this video was kind of like all over the place. I just wanted to dump out my thoughts. I was not prepared today. I'm kind of frustrated today, to be honest. I'm a little stressed out, but what do you think about this whole idea of personality disorders coming from a combination of trauma and genetics? And do you see it the way that I do, that it kind of like starts a lot of times anyway in childhood with childhood trauma and branches out from there and goes in many different directions for different people into different kinds of personality problems, but it's all still kind of starting from the same place, and generally you can treat a lot of it in the same way. That's my theory. What do you think about all of this? Let me know down below in the comments. If you have concerns about anything that I've said, leave those there too. Just don't be mean about it, because I will delete your comments, and I look forward to hearing from you.